Morning, Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event, an author talk with Wayne Dawkins, Emanuel Celler, Immigration and Civil Rights Champion. I am Allison Gifford. I am the librarian at the Alexandria Law Library, located in the courthouse in Old Town. A quick reminder that there will be plenty of time for questions during today's program. If you have any questions for Wayne, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box and I will work them in as we go. So there's no need to hold your questions till the end. The Alexandria Library System has just recently acquired a copy of Emanuel Celler, and it is currently being processed and cataloged and will be available for checkout in the coming days. Besides Wayne's current book, he has also written a 2012 book entitled City Son, Andrew W. Cooper's Impact on Modern Day Brooklyn. In just a second, I will put a link in the box, in the Q&A box as to where to purchase these books if you would like. Wayne is currently a professor of professional practice at Morgan State University in Baltimore, and we are happy to have him here today. So thanks for being here, Wayne, and take it away.
Okay, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. So let us begin. So my topic is Emanuel Celler. And actually, he was a supporting character in that previous biography I wrote of journalist and voting rights activist Andrew W. Cooper, who happened to be one of my major mentors. Well, as for Celler, why I was interested in him in the first place, he is maybe the most important legislator of the mid to late 1900s. I know it's quite a claim, but I'm going to make the case here. So he resurrected civil rights and reformed immigration. So the last US civil rights law was traced back to the 1860s, immediately after the Civil War and going into the Reconstruction era. After 3 generations of Jim Crow segregation, Emanuel Celler placed civil rights on the table with his 1957 and 1960 bills that set up the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act. And if you could show that first slide of the signing of the Civil Rights Act, please. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Celler is standing right at LBJ's left shoulder, because he was the floor manager and virtually the midwife of the legislation. A year later, Celler watched LBJ sign his signature achievement at the base of the Statue of Liberty, the Immigration Reform Act, which ended 40 years of discriminatory national origins policy. Celler had fought for the change since he was a freshman congressman in the 1920s. Okay, if you could show the slide of his where he grew up. I'm going to now talk about his Jewish and Catholic immigrant roots. So Celler was born in 1888. He was the grandson of immigrants who fled Germany for America during an 1848 revolt in Europe. Celler's childhood was upper middle class amid working class and poverty-stricken neighbors. His dad was prosperous for making bourbon in the basement of their home until the business failed. Celler attended Boys High School and was accepted to Columbia University. He commuted to 116th Street and Broadway and continued his education at Columbia School of Law. Celler married Stella Barr, his high school sweetheart. To help support the family, Celler sold wine from a wagon to immigrant families. And he was practicing law in Manhattan when he was encouraged to run for a Republican-held House seat in Brooklyn. Celler won in 1922. When he took office, he was confronted with the anti-immigrant and eugenics mood of the Congress. Despite a ferocious debate that included like-minded colleagues such as Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the future four-term mayor of New York City, President Calvin Coolidge signed national origins into law. Celler was witness to the enactment, then repeal of Prohibition, and he also witnessed the Great Depression, or lived it, the Great Depression and the Franklin D. Roosevelt New Deal. Celler was challenged by his Jewish and American roots. So also during the 1930s, Celler watched with horror as Nazism threatened Jews in Europe. America at the time was not a refuge. Isolationism was the political mood, yet Celler did not quit. He worked with Jewish leaders who sounded alarms that a Holocaust was underway. Celler confronted American Nazism in New York, in one case briefly upsetting FDR. Celler also prepared Americans for the worst. In 1940, he wrote a book called The Draft and You that efficiently mapped recruiting for military service in order to avoid the waste and bureaucracy that cost lives during World War I and the Civil War. So there is a slide, if you can, that will show three presidents: FDR, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and this covered World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, which was some of an inkling of Celler's productive years to come. He is now emerging as a fully engaged Washington, D.C. dealmaker. Celler pressed FDR and the State Department to resume diplomatic relations with the Vatican. We had not had relations with the Vatican for decades, I believe going back to the late 1800s, believe it or not. With Truman as president, Celler lobbied for creation of a homeland for Jews in Israel. That move was tricky. Britain controlled Palestine, and the United States did not want to anger Middle East Arab neighbors who provided cheap oil to us. Nevertheless, the State of Israel was created in 1948. On Truman's watch, Celler became chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, then briefly lost it when Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, and the House became majority Republican. Eisenhower worked with Celler because and here's a term for discussion, Eisenhower mortgaged refugees who wanted to enter the United States. Celler regained the chairmanship and worked with the president. And I'd love to hear questions. Why are we talking about mortgaging of people? But we'll save that for the Q&A. Okay, there's another slide that shows some allies of Celler. Claire Booth Luce, Estes Kefauver, and Herbert Lehman. So Claire Booth Luce and Celler co-authored legislation to recognize India, the former British colony, as an independent democracy. This was an important post World War II move and beginning of the Cold War. And yes, that name Luce, yes, Claire Booth Luce was the wife of media mogul Henry Luce of Time Inc., Time and Life Inc. Estes Kefauver and Celler co-authored antitrust and anti-monopoly legislation. That was a big part of Celler's legislative life, but my main focus has been civil rights and immigration. Celler advanced to the US Senate, and he even ran for president in the late 50s. Meanwhile, Senator Herbert Lehman of New York was Celler's proxy in a battle with Red Scaremonger Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. Okay, and if you can, please show the slide of Presidents John F. Kennedy, LBJ, and Congressman William McCullough. Okay, what happened here? My stuff stopped. Okay. Oh, we jumped the gun here. I'm sorry. Sticky slide. There's a slide that's going to say Black Lives Matter to Emanuel Celler. If you'll show that, please. And it has 3 faces. So on the left is Clarence Mitchell. In the center is Matthew Henson. And on the right is a member of the Women's Army Corps. Despite the Jim Crow status quo of the early to mid 1900s, Emanuel Celler was an unwavering advocate of equality for Black citizens. He pressed for anti-lynching legislation that nettled white Southern Democrats. Celler successfully lobbied for a pension for Matthew Henson, who with Robert E. Peary successfully reached the North Pole in 1909. And Celler championed Black WACs who challenged discriminatory practices during World War II. In 1957, Celler authored civil rights legislation. Though he often worked with Clarence Mitchell of the NAACP, Mitchell believed the legislation was toothless. Yet the law and a 1960 follow-up actually had bite. And now we have, if you'll show the slide of the 2 presidents and Congressman McCullough. Okay. So now on to civil rights and immigration reform. As Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon B. Johnson aided passage of Celler's 1957 Civil Rights Bill. As president, Celler assisted LBJ with the landmark 1964 Civil Rights and 1965 Voting Rights Acts. Work on the breakthrough civil rights law actually began during the John F. Kennedy administration. LBJ finished the work, and not to put a fine point on it, JFK was assassinated in November of 1963, and LBJ was elevated to president, and he picked up the baton and finished. Celler also began work on immigration reform during the JFK years, and then the completed bill was signed in 1965 by LBJ. William McCullough of Ohio was the GOP, and I have minority leader, but actually the correct term is GOP ranking member of the committee. He worked with Celler on the legislation. A special note about the immigration reform. Hart-Celler immigration was the name of the law because the Senate sponsor was Philip Hart of Michigan. He was the co-sponsor of record. However, junior Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts finished the work with Celler, and here's why. Philip Hart of Michigan, who has a Senate building in Washington named after him and was known as the conscience of the Senate. He was consumed with work regarding the auto industry in Detroit. So yes, he's the senator of record, but Ted Kennedy worked with Celler, did the heavy lifting, and he is closely aligned. And there's a relationship there because his older brother, John F. Kennedy, had been making the case about the need to reform immigration back in the late 50s when he was a US Senator. He even wrote a book about the subject. Okay, America transformed because of Celler and others. So the 1965 immigration reform meant that foreigners who wanted to, and I'll emphasize, legally become Americans could, no matter where in the world they came. There have been exclusions on Asia, Africa, Latin America, and yes, parts of Europe. those exclusions were removed. Cold War realities and moral pressure from civil rights leaders forced these changes. And I'll add I'll add to that personally, because I am the American-born child of Caribbean immigrants. My aunt, who is Afro-Chinese from Jamaica, could not immediately come to this country with her husband, my uncle, and their kids, because we had a quota on Chinese people that was capped at 100 people before the laws were changed. So my uncle arrived here legally, but was told because his wife was half Chinese, she was going to have to wait because we had reached our quota. True story. We can talk about it if you don't believe me. She may even be listening on this call. Okay. So these are some of the crazy things that were going on. Here's the other thing about before the immigration reform. My parents are, my mother is from Panama. However, she was born in the Canal Zone, which was a colony of America until 1999. So she could easily immigrate here. My father, who was from Jamaica at the time, it was Jamaica, British West Indies. So it was still a territory of Britain. So in a bizarre way, he had easy entry because the national origins quota gave a green light to people from Northern Europe. So that included Britain, Germany, Ireland, the Scandinavian countries. But that changed after 1962, when many of the Caribbean islands were no longer colonial properties and became independent. But he made it just in time, because that was 1962 and my parents came to America in 1953. Okay, so kind of like I just took a detour, but I'm back on the main road now. As for civil rights, foes tried to kill the Civil Rights Bill, arguing that white women would be disenfranchised in order to liberate blacks. And when I say liberate blacks, as I said in another talk recently, I said the 64 civil rights gave African Americans legal first-class citizenship rights. It didn't mean that discrimination or racism suddenly just went away, but it was significant in that on paper, legally, our country was not supposed to discriminate. Okay, and there were remedies for that. Okay, Celler used cunning and wit to outsmart Representative Howard W. Judge Smith of Virginia. Specifically, his district was Alexandria, Virginia. And he was the, Howard Smith was the chairman of the Rules Committee in Congress, which, as I told a colleague in another speaking engagement, often the Rules Committee was where legislation went to die. That's where the chair could basically strangle the baby in the crib. But Celler was able to outsmart Smith a few times. And in this case, what Celler was able to do, the 1964 Civil Rights Act became more inclusive because it also added amendments or titles that forbid discrimination against Americans because of sex, gender, religious beliefs, and others. So the Civil Rights Law of 64 became an all-inclusive law for all Americans, for this richly diverse nation. Okay, there is a slide of three women, Elizabeth Holtzman, Bella Abzug, and Edna Kelly, if you can place it. So this is about the last Victorian is retired in air quotes. After 49 years of service, Emanuel Celler was upset in spring of 1972 Democratic primary by Elizabeth Holtzman, a woman young enough to be the Judiciary Committee chair's granddaughter. Holtzman went on to serve on the committee during Watergate. Had Celler been re-elected to another term, Celler would have chaired the Watergate hearings. Okay, and I note 49 years of service, but it's actually 49 years and 10 months. And it should have been 50, but here's what happened. We are used to seeing members of the new Congress take their seats in January after the elections. But Celler was so old when he came into Congress, the rule was Congress returned to Washington in March of the year after the election. So in this case, when he was finally unseated, he came up 2 months short of a half century. One of these strange quirks of history. Now, Celler's attitudes toward women's rights were more progressive than most of his male colleagues. Yet they were too Victorian for colleagues such as Bella Abzug, who was an advocate of the Equal Rights Amendment. Bella Abzug was a congresswoman representing a district in New York, New York. She was probably the model for the TV character Maude. And the other woman on the slide is Edna Kelly, who was the first woman member of Congress in the New York delegation, and she was Celler's political neighbor in Brooklyn. Okay, just dealing with my sticky cursor. Okay, so there's a slide of Celler. If you'll show that, he's walking to the Metropolitan Opera House. He has his bowler hat on and his long coat. And he was a great fan of the opera. So was he the Congressional Bulldog or stand-up comic? Celler appeared gruff and grumpy. The New York Times labeled him the Congressional Bulldog because of his tenacity. However, he was playful and droll. He doodled caricatures. He kept a diary of wry sayings for public speaking and loved to play piano in his hotel suite at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. An avid opera fan, he scolded others who protested the demolition of New York's Metropolitan Opera House because he deemed the building an architectural monstrosity. Quote, "Why the sudden urge? Is it publicity?" said Celler. "Some of them probably think Puccini is the name for spaghetti and that Richard Wagner was a baseball player." Celler, who was author of 3 constitutional amendments, which included the much discussed 25th Amendment about presidential succession, and also at least 300 laws, maybe closer to 400, died in January 1981 at age 92. And there is a slide of Celler, how he was caricatured in some newspaper cartoons. One on the left shows the battle over the Civil Rights Bill to get it to the president's desk, which was not easy. It was quite a battle. And there is another editorial cartoon on the right of, again, Celler working the legislation. These are cartoons. I took pictures of them. They were on the wall of one of his 2 surviving granddaughters. And this is Joe Rifkin's home in near Albany, New York. There is another slide, the last one, and it shows Celler and his wife had 2 daughters. The youngest, Judith, had multiple sclerosis. So her mind was razor sharp, but her body was just fell apart. But even in those times, and this is before our sensitivity to the handicapped and disabled, Celler did everything he could to include his youngest daughter. So this is a photo of Judith meeting LBJ at the White House. I think her older daughter is with her there. So you know, he made sure Judith participated whenever possible. And let's see, with that, let me go back. That, oh, this again. Sorry, everyone. Oh, okay, I'm back. That concludes my remarks. I welcome a conversation afterwards with those of you who are here. Thank you for letting me present. I think you're muted. You're muted.
Oh, brother, what a day, huh? What a great presentation. I appreciate this. I'm going to hop in. I was going to ask you about his family. You say he has two daughters, and the Judith, she had cerebral palsy. Was that what she had? Was born with?
I said MS, but it may have been cerebral palsy.
No. Was that what I forgot what it was? But it seemed like he really, was very hands-on with her at a time that probably not much medical care was available. From your book, it just seemed like the family was very involved with her in her progress.
Yes, they were very involved. And an aside, months before World War II occurred, Celler had this illness. I think it had something to do with an ingrown hair, but he was critically ill. He was near death, and he was hospitalized for months. He became disoriented. There's a scene I have in the biography where he is barking orders to one of the nurses to get messages to LBJ, because it's the run-up to World War II. We're not in it yet, but we're close to being in it. And he was delirious. And this illness was so crippling. He recovered, but it apparently curved his spine and shortened him to about 5'2" after being maybe about 5'8" or so. I learned this after the fact from one of his congressional aides who was retired in suburban Washington. And here's a story about even that. After the book published, I was still searching online sources and newspapers, and I ran across a letter that this person wrote and said, look, she wrote a letter to the Washington Post, and she was correcting the record about something. And she said, well, I know this because I was one of Celler's congressional aides. So because of the wonders of the internet, I went searching for her, and I was able to track her down. And I said, hey, I read your letter in the Post, and I've written a biography of Celler. And we had a chance to meet a few times. She invited me to her home. She wanted me to sign her book. And she told me this story, that even though some written accounts describe Celler as 5'2", she said, no, he was taller than that. But apparently his spine was curved because of that extreme illness. You know, this is one of the things I try to emphasize in the media research class I teach here at Morgan about secondary source material. Written documents are reliable, but you need to, I tell students, you need to match them with human sources you can interview, because there's always something that can contradict or throw you off just a little bit, and you try to get you try to get closest to the truth as you can.
Right,
So,
right. Speaking of his family, I know you said you got your pictures from grandson, was it? What, the
well,
two?
there are two surviving granddaughters. They're elderly now. One lives in just outside of Albany,
Okay,
and the other lives in Westchester, New York, where I started my newspaper career.
okay.
Um, so I've been in touch with the two of them, and they've been very helpful. And
Good.
now, after I was invited to write a piece for the Jewish Forward, some other relatives came forward. So there is a cousin in South Florida that we talk to on the regular. We're Facebook friends. She just sent me a post of her scuba diving.
Oh, that's
So
wild.
we become kind of besties in a
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
And then there's some other family that's come forward. So,
Well,
that's,
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to ask you, I remember in the book, the relationship of Emanuel and his wife, Stella. Stella was Jewish, right? From a Jewish family?
Yes,
Yeah. So
yes.
can you talk about that? Because that was probably not well received, huh?
Well, here's the thing. Celler, his grandparents from Germany, one was Catholic, the other was Jewish. So the father was Catholic,
Okay.
the mother was Jewish, and they marry. And then one of the daughters out of that marriage, who's Jewish because she had a Jewish mother,
Mm-hmm.
marries a Jewish man named Celler. And now the children coming forward, effectively they're Jewish. So so the marriage to Stella Barr was just fine. What's
Okay.
funny about that, speaking of the surviving grandchildren, um, the one who lives in Westchester said, for the first time, I knew there was something about how my nose is shaped that I was not entirely Jewish.
Oh, so they didn't, I mean, they
So,
weren't familiar
you
with
know,
their,
who knew?
oh, that's funny. That's funny.
Well, they're just learning. I mean,
Uh-huh.
which is why, one of the funnier things about talking about race and ethnicity. This is why I have a book called America Becoming that came out at the end of the 1900s, and that's when the writers of that book said race is a political term. As far as science, as far as humans, the only race is the human race, and the reason why we have survived as a species is because we all have each other's stuff in us. If you want any proof of that, take an ancestry test like I did,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
which shows that I'm um, close to 90% sub-Saharan African rooted, but I'm clearly at least 10% from the United Kingdom. And they narrowed it, with each update, they get more specific. So they said, okay, United Kingdom, but now they say, well, yeah, you got a little bit of British in you, but you have some Scott too, and we're all each mixed up in each other's genes. That'll be a shock to people who are segregationists or nationalists. It'll blow their minds if they look
Right, right.
into it.
That's
But
funny.
anyway,
And you're
that's
100% Brooklyn, right? Brooklynese.
well, even that has an asterisk because technically I was born in Manhattan
Oh, okay.
at Bellevue Hospital, which most people identify now as kind of a mental hospital, but back then it was a solid municipal hospital. That's where I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents lived in a one-room apartment where they put the dividers up to create the semblance of other rooms. But once I arrived, it was, oh no, we have to find someplace else. So before my first birthday, they moved to Brooklyn.
Okay.
So it's sort of like, to give an example of basketball superstar Michael Jordan is always identified with North Carolina, which is accurate. But actually, he was born in Brooklyn. and then the family
Oh,
immediately moved to North Carolina,
oh, that's
where he did
funny.
all of his growing up. Yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but I claim Brooklyn. That's I lived nearly my first 19 years on the same block in Bedford Stuyvesant. I grew up about 8 blocks from Boys High School, where Sal attended. Also near Boys High was, I did not know it at the time, was Concord Baptist Church, where the minister there was one of Martin Luther King's most trusted associates, the Reverend Gardner Taylor. They now rename part of that street, Marcy Avenue, after Gardner Taylor. And Marcy Avenue, I like to go and tease my students because Jay-Z often talks about growing up in the Marcy projects, and I'll look at my students and say, Jay-Z can't tell this elder anything about Marcy Avenue, okay?
That's funny. Oh, that's funny. So what brought you to, so just in a little capsule, what got you out of Brooklyn and up to Virginia?
Okay, well, the first 25 years of my newspaper career, if back in those days, if you worked long enough, you would move around. So I went
Hmm.
from Brooklyn, out of graduate school. I worked in Westchester, New York, just below New York, just above New York City for 4 years. And then I married, and the woman I married, who also worked at the same company, became an editor at one of the Philadelphia newspapers. I
Oh,
said, you
wow.
got to
Okay.
go take that job. I'll figure something out. And it turned out the company I worked for had a suburban daily 10 minutes from Philadelphia. I was able to get on there. I worked 12 years. That was the longest I worked at any newspaper. So from there, I moved again, out to Northwest Indiana, just near Chicago, as an editor. Worked there for a couple of years until the media landscape changed again. And then an opportunity came to move to Virginia, and that's where I worked at my last daily, which is the daily press of Newport News, Virginia.
Okay.
It was now owned by Tribune Company, as in Chicago Tribune. Um, so it covered what we call the Virginia Peninsula, which is Newport News, Hampton, Yorktown,
Sure.
Williamsburg.
Uh-huh.
The part that if I go to New England, I'll tweak them and say where English America actually began, folks. The So yeah, I try to be careful. I don't want to get pelted with
Right,
rotten
right, right.
tomatoes. But
Serious, serious.
and then on the other side of the harbor, it was the Virginian pilot that covers Norfolk, uh, Virginia Beach, Suffolk, where we live permanently. In fact, that area, when I arrived, they were now not calling it Tidewater anymore. They were calling it Hampton Roads because of the harbor. But
Oh, okay.
now there's a push. It's the it's probably the largest metropolitan area that no one can find, because
Yeah.
another term has been the seven cities, because when you add up those seven cities, you have nearly 2 million people.
Oh.
Um, so there's even this other factor, and it's interesting with this election that's coming
Mhm.
up next week. So I was introduced to a term called the Virginia Crescent, because
Oh.
as you travel along 95, of course, there's Alexandria and the Northern Virginia cities and suburbs, which is urban, and you continue down 95, and then you come to Richmond,
Hmm.
and then that's another urban area, and then you veer off of 95, and now you hit on I-64 down to Hampton Roads, or whatever we want to call ourselves. So some people call that shape the Virginia Crescent, because that's very urban, or at least suburban. And then you have the rest of the state that is still very rural.
Right, right.
Um, uh, you, so yeah, I've now lived here since 98. So I've In fact, when I moved here in '98, Hampton Roads to Tidewater, you still had people that would refer to people like me as a come here. They said you'd have to live here 25 years before you're actually accepted as a resident. I
Yeah.
think that kind of thinking has changed because of all the military bases
Mm-hmm.
in that area.
Right.
It had this kind of effect in really diversifying the community. And
Uh-huh.
also many people like the climate there. They retired. I mean, when I tell people about the Hampton Roads area, yes, we have the 4 seasons, but actually winter is a 2 month season.
Oh, wow.
By late
Yeah. Yeah.
February,
Yeah.
the trees are starting to bud again. So it's
Yeah.
nice living down there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yes.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, the more I think of, what I was taking away from your book about Emanuel Celler, to get back to him, um, I liked I liked how you put it. He had three issues, or three issues that he and correct me if I'm wrong, but he three issues that he worked on, and the first was inequitable immigration laws, civil rights slash judicial reform, and then antitrust. So like the main
Yes.
theme was equality of opportunity. And I
Yes.
really, it was just like that's amazing, that as a politician, sometimes like recently, they're kind of like all over the place. And like he really had, after reading the book, you can really see where he was coming from, quite honestly, immigration coming from his family, and in the neighborhood. And so it was just admirable, I guess, was my takeaway, of just being a real true.
Absolutely. And as Rabbi Sussman, Lance Sussman, who I was invited to give a lecture at Gratz University, which is a
Mhm.
Jewish founded institution in Philadelphia. And he said Celler was that lonely voice that said something had to be done about immigrants, and especially at that time, Jewish immigrants, because by the 30s, it is clear something horrific is going on in
Mhm.
Germany and in Europe. But we didn't have a refugee policy for anyone at that time. And Sussman said he was especially a lone voice because for the Jewish people or Jewish leaders in America, they had to be careful because at that time, if they protested too loudly, there could be dire consequences. So a lot of them bit their tongues. In
Mhm.
fact, one of my friends, a PhD and educator, who read the manuscripts, and he was searching one day, and he said, by dumb luck, he found a movie that featured Celler that was called "Who Shall Live and Who Shall Die." It was a documentary that was done about trying to get refugees out. And there were many creative things um, we did. Uh, The US was not, I said the US was not welcoming, but in fairness, they were much more welcoming than other nations that just said, no,
Mhm.
no. In fact, in the book, there's one part there where some of the refugee ships tried to go to Palestine, and there were Jews who actually sabotaged the ships. They just wanted to disable the ships, but actually they ended up sinking the ships and killing hundreds of people
Wow.
because they just did not want to start trouble with the Arabs who controlled the oil, and Palestine was a British protectorate. Now, after World War II, the world changes. I mean,
Mhm.
Britain
Mhm.
is no longer a superpower. They let go of Palestine, they let go of India. They're divesting themselves of
Mhm.
places they colonized, and now we're in a Cold War, and this immigration issue is becoming a huge problem for the U.S.
Mhm, mhm,
And you know, and the part about mortgaging, it was a matter of, by saying we only want certain people coming here, do we want to default and just let the best and brightest of them, for instance, go to the Soviet Union, the former
mhm,
Soviet Union, or to communist China, or to other adversaries? So presidents starting with Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, probably even Nixon caught some of this. Well, by the time Nixon was president, immigration reform was in its early years. Now, here's something I found mind blowing when I was in the Library of Congress doing research. It wasn't until about 1970 or so, under the Nixon administration, that we started using the term Hispanic, because um, Latin American people were just lumped in the white category. So basically, our census just said you're white or you're black,
mhm,
and but then we've evolved. We have these different categories. Suddenly, because of that immigration reform, the Asian population started to grow.
mhm,
And although small, it is much more noticeable. And Asian Americans are now, if they're second, third generation, they are fully integrated in our society.
mhm,
They are more, if you're of Asian descent, you go through that eye rolling moment where people ask where you're from. Well, I'm
mhm.
from the USA. I grew up in California, okay, and I'm third
Yeah,
generation.
yeah,
I'm as American as apple pie.
right,
So
right.
we've been transformed,
Mhm.
transformed.
Yeah. Well, which leads me to ask, when I got your book, it was like, I'm reading what Emanuel Celler did, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of stuff. And I'm thinking, I mean, I wasn't born under a rock, but it was just like that name just does not, it's not like a Ted Kennedy, or, Edward Kennedy or John F. Kennedy, or, a big politician's name. And it's like he had his hands in a lot. How, I know they didn't have social media back then, but why do you think, was that his personality? Did he like stay in the background? Was he not like a look at me, look
As I
what I did?
told a colleague and mentor and personal hero of mine, I was interviewed by journalist Earl Caldwell, who is just an icon.
Mhm.
Your law library, for instance, for any student of media law, they are going to have to study his case, which is called Caldwell versus Hayes.
Mhm.
Caldwell versus U.S. The Supreme Court case, because it's alphabetized, is called Brandsburg versus Hayes. It's three cases, but the most important one is the Caldwell case, because it's about reporters being able to protect their sources. Because
Uh-huh.
when he was a New York Times reporter, he covered the Black Panthers and got in close. The Justice Department wanted him to testify. He refused. The case went to the Supreme Court. The court ruled that journalists do not have a special privilege to protect sources. But what happened was he lost in court, but 40 states passed shield laws to give
Mm.
reporters that protection. Now, I went roundabout, but Caldwell asked me this at a recent speaking opportunity, and I said, someone said there are two kinds of members of Congress. There are show horses and there are workhorses. And
That's good.
Celler definitely was a workhorse. It's not
Mhm.
that he was not afraid of a camera, although he was not your kind of photogenic
Mhm.
kind of person. But if you let him talk policy, yeah, he'll get in front of a camera and talk. But the most important thing, I was fascinated by him because he is somebody who is hiding in plain view. And,
Mhm.
as I told
Excellent. Yeah.
Caldwell and others, there are 650,000 pieces of paper about Celler at the Library of Congress. So I made many trips there. Now,
Mhm.
I did not go through all 650,000 pieces, but I went through a lot of them that I
Mhm.
think that mattered. And with this book, 2 chapters were cut from the book as a compromise
Oh, okay.
because I wanted it to publish. I had worked on it 7 years. I wanted to get it published. It's an academic press, so it was peer reviewed and vetted. But the 2 chapters that were cut was, the first one was, okay, how did immigration reform work out after the 1965 law? And what I was writing was that for about 30 years after 1965, immigration reform was a bipartisan effort of Republicans and Democrats to particularly control immigration at the southern border. They knew people were coming over illegally, but how could we best manage it and absorb them? So the biggest problems with illegal immigration, actually the biggest problems that don't get talked about enough, are people that come in legally and get green cards, but then once they expire, they disappear in the shadows and they can't be found to either renew or they have to go home. So that's one part. The other part, in order to pass immigration reform, it may be a shock to many Americans, but our country never intended to have closed borders at the southern border. As a well-known syndicated columnist, Molly Ivins, famously said, and she was a Texan. She was an Ivy League educated Texan, and often she would kind of go into character in a kind of a Texas drawl, and she'd say, you know, we like our Mexicans because we let them come over and they pick our crops, they raise our children, they build things for us, and when the economy goes bad, we can just push them back over the border. So we liked our borders open, but now we've had to get them under control. We've discovered recently that Latin American people coming over the border are not exclusively from Mexico. They're coming from Central America. They're apparently fleeing some kind of oppression, whether it's drug gangs or other bandits, or climate change has affected them. They have been devastated by natural disasters and they want to get somewhere else. But we're now finding out recently, if you check the Sunday news shows, okay, we now know that Haitians were taking a roundabout way coming into Brazil and then trying to come over our border. And that created some uncomfortable scenes. But now we're learning that people are coming from the Ukraine. They're coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
So it was a chapter about, okay, what's going on? What are we doing to manage it or to reform it again? But after the previous president was in office, with the things that he did or his administration did, whatever I was writing was rendered incoherent. So I'm trying to maybe come back and rewrite that. Maybe that could be a chapter in an academic journal. The other chapter that was cut, it was more a pop culture thing. I was just kind of pointing out people who of Asian descent, Latino descent, others African, who are now full-fledged citizens who would have never been that post before 1965. I mean, if you look at politically, when you look at anyone from Barack Obama to Ted Cruz to the former governor of South Carolina, who's of Asian Indian descent, to the other former governor, Asian Indian descent in Louisiana, both Republicans. This would have never happened. There's a part in the book, for instance, about a naturalized American citizen of Asian Indian descent who had his citizenship revoked. And he went to the Supreme Court and he said, look, if you're basing this on race or ethnicity, I'm Aryan. Which when the courts ruled, they said, you know what, based on the science, you're right, but we're not letting you in anyway. It's revoked. And this was a World War I veteran who was living in Oregon, and
Mhm.
he had this, I think his last name was Singh, and he had after becoming a naturalized citizen, it was taken away from him. But I mean, it's just so much there, and
Uh-huh.
I really have to thank a Canadian professor who wrote a paper about Celler, and he basically said, why are you ignoring this man who's just hiding in plain view? He did so much, so much.
Yeah.
And I found it. I was still working on the book when I arrived at Morgan State 4 years ago, and after doing a search, it popped up in our library, and it was one of the greatest gifts that helped me wrap up this book.
Yeah.
To find that information.
Yeah. Actually, if you read a follow-up book, you should entitle it "Hiding in Plain Sight,"
Yeah.
because that
Yeah.
is exactly how, once you said it, I'm like, that's exactly what I would say about Emanuel Celler. It just,
Yeah, I'm fighting to get him known again.
yeah.
The federal courthouse in Brooklyn was until a few years ago the Emanuel Celler
Oh,
U.S. District Court,
uh-huh.
and it's well known. Growing up in New York, and also when I initially worked for my mentor, I would go cover cases in that courthouse, and that was known for many years as the courthouse where people get prosecuted for serious crimes, whether they're
Mhm.
mobsters or other folks, where the U.S. District Court just across the water, that's called the Southern District, dun dun, when you watch Law and Order, that's the
Yeah.
courthouse you see at Fort Police Square. That was always, until recently, was known as the White Shoe Courthouse, that didn't prosecute criminals until, and here's a twist of history, until Rudy Giuliani arrived and was the U.S. attorney, and that's when he was known as the hard-charging, crime-fighting prosecutor. I don't even recognize this man now.
Yeah.
What he has become.
Yeah. 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 Oh,
He's the
that's
guy responsible for breaking up the 5
yeah.
mob families in New York in the
Yeah.
90s.
Exactly. Yeah. Quite the
Yeah.
bulldog. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just very fascinating, Wayne. I'm really glad that we were able to do this. We're coming up on the 12 o'clock hour, and we had a great discussion. Any last requests or questions from our attendees, please? But otherwise, we're going to have this on the Alexandria Library YouTube channel page. So, spread the word. I will send you a link when it's up, so you can share it with your students, family, friends. And but again, thank you for joining us, and great book. Once again, here he is, Emanuel Celler. And we will have it in the library soon, so for checkout. If not, you can purchase it. Thank you, Wayne.
Okay, it was a blessing and a joy to be here. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Take care.